You need to hear what two lifelong hunting partners ran into on a ridge in the Appalachian Mountains, because one of them hasn't picked up a rifle since. In September of 2019, deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Southwest Virginia, two brothers-in-law set out for what should have been their 15th straight year of deer season on the same ridge, a trip so routine they could have done it blind. Everything was normal until dusk, when something crossed the river below their camp that should not have been able to stand on two legs, let alone move like it did. By the time the sun came up, one man was soaked in rain and silence. The other was gripping a rifle he'd fired twice in the dark, and neither of them has driven back up that mountain since. This is the account of Appalachian hunters, and the encounter that ended 15 years of tradition in one night. Earl Whitfield was 42, forklift certified at a lumberyard outside Marion, Virginia, and half-deaf in his left ear from 20 years of engine noise. It was the kind of hearing loss that made a man watch a room instead of listening to it, and up on that ridge, it was about to matter more than he knew. It was a Tuesday. Earl had taken the day off like he did every year, packed the truck the same way he always did, and picked up his brother-in-law, Joe Pruett, at 6 in the morning like clockwork. 15 years running. Same ridge, same week of September. Same stretch of trail they could both walk with their eyes closed. Joe was 44, a disabled Army vet, knees held together by cortisone shots and stubbornness. This trip was the one thing that still felt like it did before he got hurt, and he wasn't about to let bad knees take it from him. He hadn't told his wife, Earl's sister, just how bad those knees had gotten. Earl suspected this might be Joe's last season on foot, though neither said it out loud. By early afternoon, they'd covered 11 miles without cutting a single fresh track, which wasn't unusual for a dry September. What was unusual was the turkey sign. There wasn't any. No scratching in the leaf litter where a flock should have been working the ridge for grubs. No fresh tracks in the soft dirt along the creek bed. The same creek bed that had turkey sign on it every year they'd hiked this stretch. Joe joked it off, said the birds must have moved to the next ridge over this year. Earl didn't say what he was actually thinking, which was that in 15 years the turkeys had never once done that. The afternoon light had gone the flat gray it always did before dusk, and the switchbacks up toward camp were as familiar to both men as their own driveways. A woodpecker worked at a dead poplar somewhere below them, steady and unbothered. Nothing about the day looked wrong. It just felt like one piece of a picture Earl had memorized 15 times over had gotten rearranged, and he couldn't yet say which piece it was. They made camp a little after 5, set up the tent between the same two hickories they always used, and got the fire going before the light dropped all the way out. Joe cracked a beer and stretched his bad knee toward the flames. For 20 minutes, it was just another September on the ridge. Then Earl looked up toward the river, and everything about that 15-year tradition changed for good. Earl looked up toward the river just as the last of the daylight caught something moving at the water's edge, and his stomach dropped before his brain even caught up with what his eyes were telling him. Something was crossing the current, on two legs. It stood 8 feet tall, and it shoved through the river the way a truck shoves through standing water, current breaking off it in sheets instead of soaking around it. Earl's bad ear meant he clocked it a half-second late. Joe already had his rifle half raised by the time Earl turned his head, and that gap between them was a detail Earl would think about for days. Neither man said a word. Joe lowered the rifle slow, like sudden movement might draw attention, and for a few seconds they watched the far bank where the thing had gone up into the tree line and out of sight. "Bear," Joe said, quiet. Didn't sound like he believed it. "Bear doesn't cross a river standing up," Earl said. "They should have let it go right there. 15 years of good sense told them to get back to the fire, get the tent zipped, and forget they'd seen anything at all. But neither man had tagged a deer all day, not so much as a fresh rub worth a second look, and after 11 miles of nothing, something in both of them wanted one thing to show for the day, even if it wasn't a buck. That want pulled them toward the water instead of camp. They found where it had come out of the river on their side, mud churned up in prints too long and too narrow to be anything Earl had ever field-dressed. The tracks led straight into a stretch of deadfall neither man had gone near in 2 years. Blowdown from a derecho that had ripped through the valley back in 2017, thick enough that Earl had detoured around it every season since. Whatever made those tracks hadn't detoured around anything. It had gone straight through. 4-inch limbs, still holding their bark, snapped clean like green sticks a man could break over his knee. Except these weren't limbs a man could break over his knee, not without tools, not without time. This had happened in seconds, and it hadn't slowed the thing down once. Earl's stomach turned over as he crouched next to one busted limb, running his thumb along the splintered wood, and a wet mineral cold rolled off the river behind them. Under that cold sat something else, faint, sour, wrong, and neither man said what that smell reminded them of. "We should probably head back," Earl said. Joe didn't answer right away. He was still staring down the tunnel that thing had punched through the brush, rifle loose in his hands, looking like a man who'd come out here for a deer and found something else, and wasn't ready to let go of it yet. That right there was the only real disagreement these two had ever had on this ridge in 15 years. Joe wanted to keep tracking while there was still light. Earl wanted to be back at camp with the tent zipped before dark. Neither pushed hard enough to win the argument outright. They just stood there a second too long, both feeling the day tilt sideways in a way it never had before. In the end, the light made the decision for them. It dropped fast, the way it always does deep in a valley, and by the time they turned back toward camp, they were picking their way through brush they could barely see. They didn't talk much on the walk back. Every few minutes, one would glance over his shoulder toward the water, like checking a wound to see if it was still bleeding. Earl kept thinking about that half-second gap, the gap between when Joe's rifle came up and when Earl understood there was something to raise it at. He'd never needed his ears out here before. Joe had always covered that blind spot without either saying so. Tonight, for the first time in 15 years, Earl wasn't sure that was going to be enough. By the time they lost the trail markers they'd tied that morning, full dark had come down over the ridge, and both men were relying on a single headlamp between them because Joe's had died somewhere back at the deadfall. Earl led. He knew this ridge by feel. Every root, every drop-off, every place the trail cut close to the edge. But knowing a place by feel and seeing it clearly enough to trust your footing were two different things. And tonight the gap between them felt wider than it ever had. Neither man said much. Every so often Joe's boot caught a root and he'd grunt through his knee, and Earl would slow without being asked, the same rhythm they'd fallen into 100 times over 15 years. Tonight it just felt different. Earl couldn't have said why, he just knew it did. They came up on camp from the east side, same as always, and Earl clicked the headlamp toward the tent first out of habit. The zipper was torn clean off one side. Their gear was strung out across 15 feet of dirt, like something had gone through it looking for one specific thing and hadn't cared what got wrecked along the way. The cooler was on its side, lid bent back at an angle it shouldn't bend. And Joe's duffel, the old canvas one, the one his wife had sewn a reflective orange patch onto years back so it wouldn't get left behind at some trailhead, sat gutted next to the fire pit, that patch torn half loose at one corner, hanging by a few threads. Neither man had heard a single sound the whole time they'd been gone. Not a rustle, not a snapped branch. Nothing carrying across the ridge the way sound usually did, which meant whatever had done this had either moved without making noise, or had finished up and cleared out long before they'd turned back toward camp, and there was no way to know which of those was true, and no way to feel okay about either answer. Joe crouched by his duffel, running a thumb along that torn patch the same way Earl had run his thumb along the busted deadfall an hour earlier. He didn't say anything. His jaw was tight enough that Earl could see it working from 6 feet away. "We're not sleeping out here," Joe said finally. Earl agreed, but even that plan came with a problem, because 2 miles of unfamiliar dark stood between them and the truck, and Joe's knee had already logged 15 miles today without complaint. 2 men, 1 bad knee, 1 bad ear, and a 2-mile stumble through terrain neither could see clearly. None of that sounded like a good trade for whatever was already sitting 50 feet from where they stood. So they didn't hike out. They climbed into the truck instead, doors locked, windows up, telling themselves 4 wheels and steel beat a blind walk through unfamiliar woods at night. It felt like the smart call in the moment. Neither was fully sure of that an hour later. The vinyl seats were cold enough to bite through denim, and Earl's fingers had gone numb enough that he had to check by feel whether the rifle's safety was on, running his thumb over the switch twice to be sure. Above the ridge, clouds had rolled in fast enough that neither man clocked them building, blotting out what little moon there'd been. Earl checked his phone out of habit. No signal, which wasn't unusual up here, except tonight it felt less like bad luck and more like the mountain had planned it that way. Earl ran the numbers on his insulin again, quieter this time, doing the math in his head instead of out loud. 2 days, maybe less if tonight went sideways, before that mattered more than anything currently parked 50 feet from his tent. Joe sat rigid in the driver's seat, rifle across his lap, staring out at a tree line neither of them could see past anymore. "You hear that?" he said. Earl hadn't heard anything, and with his ear that never meant much. Tonight, it meant everything. Morning couldn't come fast enough, and by 5 they'd decided not to wait for it. Earl's insulin math had gone from background noise to something sharper, and neither man wanted to spend another hour on this ridge. They started loading the truck bed by headlamp, moving fast, throwing gear in without folding anything. That's when the sky opened up. Not a buildup, not the kind of rain that starts light and works its way into something worse. 1 second the air was just cold, and the next it was a wall of water coming sideways, driven by wind that hadn't been there 30 seconds earlier. Thunder cracked so close behind it that Earl felt it in his teeth before he heard it, and it swallowed every other sound on the mountain whole. The temperature dropped fast enough that Earl's breath started fogging between lightning strikes. His hands, already numb, went past numb into something closer to useless. Then the second strike hit, and for half a second the whole tree line lit up white. Earl's eyes went straight to the spot they always went to first, the deadfall, the same tangle from the day before. And something was standing at the edge of it that made every hair on his arms lock straight up before his brain even finished processing what he was looking at. It was tall. Not tall like a big man is tall. Tall like it had never once needed to fit through a doorway. 10 feet, maybe more, built like something had taken a man's frame and stretched it, then packed it with muscle that moved under a coat of dark, matted hair. The rain was hitting it the same as it hit everything else on that ridge, except it wasn't soaking in. It was running off in sheets, the way water runs off a truck hood, like the hide underneath wasn't built to hold on to anything, not even the storm. The light died, black again. Earl's heart was slamming so hard he could feel it in his throat. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then the third strike came, longer this time, and Earl got the part he wished to God he hadn't. Its head was cocked slightly, facing them dead on, and its mouth was open. Not screaming, not roaring, just open, slack, like it had forgotten to close it. And even at that distance, Earl could make out teeth that didn't belong on anything that walked on 2 legs. Long, uneven, yellowed things, wet and catching what little light there was. A thick rope of drool hung off its bottom jaw, swinging once as its head tilted another few degrees toward them. Its hands hung low at its sides, and even from here Earl could see the claws curling past where fingers should have ended, black and thick as pry bars. The smell hit before the dark swallowed the image again. Wet dog gone wrong, and underneath it, something like a struck match, sharp and chemical, and wrong in a way Earl couldn't place. Then the light cut, and it was gone. Joe shouted something. Earl couldn't make out a single word of it over the thunder, only that Joe's mouth was moving and his rifle was already coming up. Joe broke left, toward the tree line. Earl broke right for the truck, boots skidding in mud that hadn't existed 20 minutes earlier. He hit the driver's door and grabbed the handle. It didn't give. Locked. Keys still in his other pocket. Fingers too numb to feel for them fast enough. For 1 full second, Earl just stood there with his hand still wrapped around a locked handle, rain running down the back of his collar, and understood with total clarity that he had no idea which direction Joe had gone, or whether he was about to find out the same way Joe's duffel bag had. He hauled himself into the camper shell instead, yanked the latch down from the inside, and pressed himself flat against the cold metal floor. The whole truck lurched sideways. Not a hit, not an impact, a shove. Slow, deliberate, like something was walking the truck toward the drop-off in a series of patient pushes, testing the weight of it each time before pushing again. Not thrashing, not frenzied, patient. And that was so much worse than rage would have been, because rage runs out. This didn't feel like it was going to run out of anything. 2 rifle shots cracked through the rain, one right after the other, and the rocking stopped. Earl lay there in the dark, breath fogging against the cold metal an inch from his face, and had absolutely no way of knowing if those shots meant Joe had found it, or if it had found Joe first. Earl didn't move for what felt like an hour. He lay flat against that cold metal floor, listening to rain hammer the camper shell, waiting for the next shove that never came. The storm didn't let up. Neither did the dark. Time just sort of stopped meaning anything. When gray finally started leaking in around the edges of the shell, Earl forced himself to unlatch the door and push it open. Joe was standing there, soaked through to the bone, rifle still faintly smoking in the wet morning air, and completely alone. He'd circled back through the trees on foot the second he understood what he was looking at, working his way around the long way instead of crossing open ground again. He didn't say how long that had taken him. Earl didn't ask. Neither man said much of anything while they broke down what was left of camp together. Joe's hands weren't quite steady enough for the tent poles, so Earl did those. Joe carried what he could carry. The only thing either of them touched twice was Joe's duffel. The old canvas one, the torn orange patch still hanging half loose at the corner, still sitting right where they'd left it in the truck bed the whole night through. Neither man had thought to grab it during the storm, hadn't even remembered it existed until now. It didn't matter. It was still there in the gray light of morning, and somehow that felt like proof that any of what had happened last night was even real. They didn't talk on the drive down. Not for the first 20 minutes. Then Joe started crying. Earl had known this man for going on 20 years. 2 tours overseas, a divorce that should have broken him, 15 years on this same ridge every September, and not once, not one single time, Had Earl ever seen Joe cry? Not at the divorce. Not at either homecoming. Joe just wasn't built that way, or Earl had always figured he wasn't. He cried the whole way down the mountain. Quiet. No sound to it at all, just his jaw working and his eyes wet, staring straight out the windshield the entire time. He never explained why. Earl never asked why. Some things a man just doesn't ask another man, especially not after a night like that one. By the time they hit the trailhead parking lot, the sky had cleared out completely, and the ridge behind them looked exactly like it always had. The turkeys were back. Earl heard them before he even got out of the truck. The same scratching in the leaf litter that should have been there the whole time. The same birds that had gone missing for one single day out of 15 straight years. It should have felt like relief. It didn't, not exactly. It felt more like the whole mountain had exhaled right along with them, like whatever had been holding its breath up there had finally let it go. Neither man has been back to that ridge since. Not because of the storm, not even because of what came out of that tree line in the lightning. What Earl can't get past, even now, is how it never charged the truck outright. It could have. It clearly had the strength to end that rocking in half a second flat if it wanted to. It didn't. It pushed, slow and patient, like it had all the time in the world. And that's the part Earl still can't explain. How calm it was, waiting for the two of them to finally be alone.